Time was we made light of it. Every kid got it. It was part of growing up. Then we learned what it could do and that it didn't have to be. But times and attitudes changed amid a flood of suspicion and misinformation. And so now it's back in Europe, in Africa, in the U.S., and very possibly in Arkansas. Measles and its threat. Next on a special edition of Arkansas Week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Barely a generation ago, we thought we had it licked. Having banished smallpox from the face of the earth and all but eradicated polio in the developed world, it seemed that a cluster of ailments commonly referred to as childhood diseases would be next. Indeed, enormous progress was made over the past quarter century, but now they're coming back. Chickenpox, mumps, and especially measles. It has returned with a vengeance in some parts of the nation and the world, and doctors fear it could rise to a fury. Welcome to a special edition of Arkansas Week. Dr. Joe Thompson is president of the Arkansas Center for Health Improvement. Dr. Gary Wheeler is chief medical officer for the State Department of Health. And Dr. Jose Romero is director of Pediatric Infectious Diseases at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences and Arkansas Children's Hospital. Gentlemen, doctors, thanks very much for being with us. Dr. Thompson, we'll begin with you. As of mid-morning Friday, as we prepare this broadcast, not a single reported case of measles, confirmed case of measles in Arkansas. But in every state surrounding Arkansas, there has been. So, just a matter of time for us?
You know, we've had nationwide a resurgence of measles. It's a number in the hundreds, but it is growing. And each week we have a number of states that are added to that list. So far, Arkansas has avoided that, but I think it is likely that sometime in the coming weeks or months, we have our first case here in Arkansas.
Gentlemen?
Yeah, I would agree with Joe completely. I think it's likely because of the incredible amount of travel that occurs around the United States and the world that somebody will bring in a case of measles, and it's likely that we'll identify that case before long.
Well, national and certainly global travel, Dr. Romero, seems to be central to the present dilemma in the U.S.
That's correct. So most of the epidemics or outbreaks have occurred from imported cases that then take seed in our communities that have low immunization rates and spread outward from there.
Right. If I could comment, it wasn't but just a couple of years ago that we had eradicated indigenous measles from the Western Hemisphere. And so this is unfortunately a consequence of foreign cases coming in to communities where not everybody was fully vaccinated, and it allowed it to spread from that case that was imported to the community, and that's what we're facing now.
Yeah, before we, I'm sorry, Dr. Romero.
No, I was just going to state that in Europe, for example, there is a widespread, large epidemic or ongoing epidemic outbreak of measles. And so going to those countries and coming back without immunization, not being immunized, places that individual at risk for acquiring the disease there.
Yeah. Australia, too, another
yes.
epicenter. Before we go any farther on this, let's have a fresh look or a refresher course, anyway, in measles. I can recall as a kid watching cartoons and seeing flyers, in the newspaper. I mean, people made fun of measles, spots and all that. Hey, it was we had an almost casual attitude about it, not except maybe in the medical community.
Well,
what is measles and
sure.
What does it do?
So, measles is a virus. It is a very contagious, one of the most contagious communicable diseases that we have. If one person that's unimmunized, or if a person with measles is in a group of 100 people that are not immunized, probably more than 90% of those that are unimmunized or unprotected will contract the disease.
If you're in the room with it, you're going to get it.
If you have no immunity, you're going to probably succumb to that condition. Symptoms present within 7 to 10 days, fever, upper respiratory infections, the rash comes on. It's pretty severe illness just in its typical form, but it can spread to cause pneumonia, to cause infection or encephalitis of the brain, and even go on to progress to major long-term mental problems or even death.
Death.
Yes.
Are adults as vulnerable as children?
I think adults are as vulnerable as children. I think what we're seeing now is the adult presentation of the condition because they were not immunized as children. 50 years ago, we would have all been exposed. We would all had it as children and then had lifelong immunity. We introduced vaccines for protection, but those people who didn't get protected or for whom their immunity has waned, didn't get the second shot, are now coming down with it as adults.
Okay, and let me sidestep for just a moment. This isn't just measles. We're also seeing a resurgence in mumps. Am I correct? Chickenpox, another commonly referred to as childhood ailments. Dr. Romero?
That's correct. We're seeing more epidemics or more outbreaks of whooping cough. There have been and there are ongoing outbreaks of mumps. Hepatitis A is another childhood disease, if you will. We have an epidemic in our state, an outbreak in our state, and there are many states that have that. There have been outbreaks of varicella chickenpox related to not vaccination or to low immunity in the community.
There's some sad irony here in that only a few months ago, Arkansas lost, I guess, what she would be termed the queen of immunization in Arkansas, and that's Betty Bumpers, who launched a campaign in the early 1970s, every child by, I think it was 72.
By 2. Yeah.
Or 72. Whichever, get every kid immunized. What? And it was enormously successful. I mean, the numbers demonstrated that.
Right.
What happened?
Well, I think it was incredibly successful. Her partnership with Rosalind Carter, the way they went across this country and really stumped to improve immunization programs had a dramatic consequence. There was funding that came forth at the federal level to enable and strengthen immunization programs in states. We did great. And I think the problem with immunization, like many diseases, is its success. The fact that people didn't see these diseases anymore has made them a little bit less fearful and likely to make decisions that are not in their best interest because they perceive the risk as low. And so what happened is that we've seen either immunization rates go down over time or clusters of populations who have chosen to avoid immunization because they perceive the risk of immunization to be higher than the risk of disease. What happens when we have these new outbreaks is that people remember how bad it is, and then we begin to see some recovery in the immunization rates.
Well, just to build, I do think parents in the 60s and 70s had seen children, had actually experienced the conditions themselves. So they were more motivated to try to protect their children and to actually accept and have their children immunized. We went 50 years and many of those conditions have been largely extinguished. But because of the world in which we live, the travel, the exposure internationally, the movement of people, those conditions now have been reintroduced, and the knowledge of how bad it can be is being refreshed on parents' minds, and hopefully we can raise their level of awareness to increase the immunization rates.
Beyond simply lowering our guard, though, there's also the fear factor, unto paranoia, and a mountain of misinformation, Dr. Romero, about the efficacy, the safety of these vaccines.
Yeah, there is misinformation, some of it unintentionally propagated, others purposely propagated. The measles, for example, there was a large error by a physician investigator in Great Britain that attributed measles vaccine with autism. And that's been debunked. The physician has been debarred, or if you will, has lost their license and cannot practice medicine anymore in Britain because he committed such egregious acts in the creation of this data. So people have latched onto that, and it's propagated itself through the internet, through other means, and leading to very false information regarding the safety of that vaccine. It's an extremely safe vaccine.
But from the parent's perspective, you can imagine I've got a child who gets a lot of immunizations before school entry, and for those parents whose child has autism, it happens at about the same time. So it's easy for them to latch on to a false source of information looking for a cause. But NIH, CDC, philanthropy has invested tens of millions of dollars to explore this and has really debunked the association. So there's a need to have parents go to sources of information that they can trust to get accurate information to make that individual decision about whether to immunize their child or not.
One of the side effects of all that, unfortunately, is it takes people away from where they need to be working. Autism is an incredibly serious and widespread problem. And I think a lot of research effort and intensity of focus was lost by going down this rabbit hole that immunization may have caused this problem. Since we've debunked those theories, we've got that research agenda back on track, and there's been incredible developments in understanding the genetic and other bases of autism, so we can take care of that like we should.
As medical scientists, you can tell this audience flatly, vaccines don't cause autism.
Absolutely.
All right, Dr. Romero.
There are many studies, not just in our country, but outside. And as early as this year, there have been more data against the thought that vaccine, or this particular vaccine, the measles vaccine, causes autism. All vaccines are extremely well studied in this country before they even come to market. The FDA looks very closely at this. They're the ones that license the vaccine. The vaccine recommendations are made by a group of voting individuals, physicians, scientists, nurses, and public representatives in the CDC called the ACIP. They look at safety with regard to the vaccine too. So it's looked at all stages of development, and the pharmaceutical companies also.
Yeah, Dr. Thompson.
I just want to, from the parent's perspective, I think no parent wants to make a poor or poorly informed decision on behalf of their children's health. And I think there are a few things that have evolved. One is the false information and the internet that's been able to find that crevices across the nation, across the world actually. So getting accurate information for parents to be informed and make good decisions. The other is to help parents recognize the decisions they make today for their child have lifelong effects. If an individual or a child has 2 of the recommended measles vaccines, they are essentially protected for life. And so this is a decision that actually affects not only their childhood and when they're under the parent's care, but will actually affect their child's adult life impact as they become world travelers and get exposed to these issues across the nations.
Right. And there have been reported cases of individuals that don't have the vaccination as adults that leave this country, go to a country where certain diseases are endemic, and they acquire the disease there because they did not have childhood immunizations. One more thing about the safety that I want to bring up is that it's not static. In other words, we just don't make a decision based on studies that were done previously. It's ongoing. So the CDC has registries and periodically looks at these registries and looks if there's a signal for some safety event for all vaccines, not just measles, but all vaccines.
Yeah, Dr. Wheeler.
One of the things that Joe alluded to is what parents are thinking. And I think we as a profession are learning a little better how to communicate with people who have questions about vaccines. And one of the most important pieces of information that they need to hear from every physician and provider that gives vaccines is the fact that we give it to our own children. I mean, that's how much we care about the safety of our own kids, whether it's our children or grandchildren. All of us are lined up to strongly support this as pediatric physicians.
There is also a school that's, I hesitate to call it holistic anyway, but children are better off without what some parents refer to as toxins injected into their body. What's your counter argument of that? Or what is the...
Sure. So I think that the counter argument to that is if you look holistically at a child's exposure for toxins, things that parents are feeding their children, things that parents are exposing their children to are potentially much more toxic than the components that are in the vaccine that have had much more rigorous testing than anything else a child is exposed to from a nutritional perspective or many environmental perspectives.
Candy bar, potato chips.
I mean, I don't want to go too far down that path. I can, but I think the testing that's been done on these vaccines, and when there has been concerns about components that could be eliminated, they've been eliminated. And I think the protections here, nothing is 100% guaranteed in the medical profession. Any test you have, any antibiotic you take could have an adverse reaction. But I think vaccines have actually had more testing for safety than almost any other medical therapeutic intervention that we've ever seen.
Have there not, in fact, though, in complete honesty, there have been cases of adverse reactions?
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
You want to
So
quite rare, in my understanding.
They are. They're far lower. So let me begin by saying that the adverse reactions or adverse events that occur with vaccines are far less than the complications of the disease itself. So those are known to occur, and they are discovered over time if necessary, but they are far few in number. So if we're talking about measles, you can have febrile seizures. There are some individuals that will have some problems with their clotting cells. So those things are known to occur, and every vaccine has some side effect associated with it. It's been studied, but they're viewed to be much, much less than the benefit that they provide.
Get a flu shot and you may feel bad for a day.
Yeah, you may feel achy, but remember the flu shot, and I think it's important for everyone to understand, the flu shot is, with exception of the live vaccine, it's a piece of the virus. And so you don't get the disease from the vaccine. You may feel crummy because you're achy or whatever, but that is part of the immune response to the vaccine.
Yes, Steve, I think it's important, again, from the parents or from the non-clinical perspective, what the vaccine is doing is it is exposing your immune system to a picture of what the infectious agent looks like. It's almost like, this is bad, file this picture away. If you see this, rev up quickly and get yourself protected. So yes, you may have fever, you may have a little soreness at the site of injection, you may have some malaise in the first 24 hours because your immune system is spreading the picture of that pathogen all over every lymph node, every white cell is getting a photograph of that picture, so that if you are exposed to the real thing, your immune system recognizes it right off the bat. So those mild, within the first 24, 48-hour symptoms should almost be accepted and not an adverse condition. It's those things that I think scare people away from saying, okay, I don't want the next one because I had a mild fever, or my child was a little fussy after the first one.
Mm-hmm. We're talking a 2-shot regimen, basically, in measles.
For measles.
Mm-hmm. And these are typically administered, gentlemen, with
12 to 15 months, and then before school entry at 6 years of age.
Okay, doctor, I think I cut you off. I didn't mean to.
Well, I think we also have to acknowledge that there are more, in addition to what Joe just described, these mild expected reactions, there are serious adverse reactions that occur. And the question is, were they related to the vaccine or not? And a lot of times we don't know because they're so rare, it's hard to tell. And we do know that, as Joe just said, these are immunological responses to vaccines. And so there may be an individual who is genetically programmed to have an adverse reaction. We acknowledge that's going to happen, but it's going to be rare. It's going to be that 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million kind of severe reaction. Patients can have allergy, immediate allergy to vaccines. It's extremely rare. And that's why the immunizations are delivered typically in a medical setting. So there are people there, so if there is that type of response, it can be appropriately managed to protect the patient.
There are rise also in the dialogue that we're, the national dialogue, global dialogue, I guess, involving vaccinations. There are cultural ramifications. There are spiritual, religious ramifications. It's frequently asserted that vaccines are the product of fetal tissue research or contain fetal material.
Jose can speak to that.
Yeah, there are two cell lines, two cells that were derived from fetal tissue. They were abortuses. Both of these abortions are important to note that these were not done to develop the vaccine. They were therapeutic. They were done under the medical guidelines at that time. Those cells were used to create the stocks that we use now, but there are no abortions or fetal tissue being used at this time. The cells themselves are being grown in a media, in fluid, that does not have anything to do with human parts or human body. And the nutrients they receive are either synthetic or they're derived from bovine serum. And so they're not abortuses continually being extracted in order to create the vaccines.
Right. The last fetal cells were used back in the 60s.
It's 50. Both of these, Dr. Wheeler is correct. Both of these these cells are now over 50 years old.
There's this also that in some denominations, to inject anything into the body is not allowed. It's
so
contrary to their doctrine.
Right. So this has been looked at by a number of ethicists and by physicians. There is a very well-written report by Dr. Gravenstein that talks about the major religions of the world and their view of the use of vaccines. And in no major religion in the world are they prescribed. That this is something that can be done and should be done. The Catholic Church, for example, had an ethicist committee come out and make a statement supporting vaccines. So I think that for almost all major religions, this is not a contraindication for vaccination. There's no contraindication for vaccination.
And while for the religion there may not be a contraindication, there may be a local church or a local faith group who has picked this up because of potential misinformation or other considerations.
Ultra-Orthodox community in New York
and that's where then you have a powder keg waiting for exposure from some outside source of the contagious agent to then cause an outbreak and potentially propagate into a major problem.
Well, you would seem to have at one point, though, a collision or at least a conflict between public policy and public health. How would you, as doctors, address that?
So
reconcile.
We had this about 15 years ago. The state had a religious exemption so that you could apply for a religious exemption and not be subject to the school entry requirements. That went to the state Supreme Court. We ended up changing it to be a philosophical exemption now. And that number is growing. It's not large, but it is growing. Gary can relay, it's a little less than 2% of school entry children. That's not evenly spread across the state. Those are in pockets, either social circles where the parents have decided not to immunize their children, or a faith-based group. And those are the pockets of individuals in Arkansas which are probably at most risk for having an importation of a contagious agent and having an outbreak in a local community, families, faith-based or otherwise. It is a challenge between the health and individual choice. But I think good information will have almost every parent want to do the right thing for their child in offering not only short-term protection, but lifelong protection.
Right. I want to pivot just a little bit because this issue of unimmunized children is really the issue. And that's a big umbrella. Under that are a small number of kids who are unimmunized because their family asked for an exemption. But there's a much bigger group that's probably 3 or 4 times bigger than that of kids who simply are not up to date on their vaccines. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One may be that they really have to struggle to get their vaccines. There have been in the last few years between 10 and 20 counties in Arkansas that the only source for childhood vaccines is the local health unit. So they may be driving 30 miles to get their vaccines, and that's hard for a lot of people who are living on who are economically challenged or have other issues. And so a lot of those kids are falling through the cracks, and that's why they're unimmunized, because we don't have enough providers out there. And the second thing is, under the law, schools are supposed to require documentation of immunization before kids go to school. And a lot of schools have been slipping on that. And one of the big things that came out of this last legislative session is a new law that was written by Justin Boyd and others that will require schools to now post the rates of unimmunized children. And hopefully that requirement will push schools to be more faithful in making sure that they help kids get the immunizations they need.
To the delight of school children, the school year is almost over. To their dismay, another one has been about 3 months away. In the interim, now until in the next several weeks, what the parents need to do? B, is the state being proactive enough?
I think parents need to know their child's immunization status. I think from their local physician, pediatrician, family physician, school records, they can check to see, is my child up to date? And so that's kind of a parent responsibility. I think with the new law of Representative Boyd, schools should proactively say, here's our immunization rate this summer, so that parents who are in a school with a low immunization rate, there can be some peer pressure, there can be some increased awareness of, okay, our school is a little under-immunized and therefore maybe more at risk. And then going into the summer, I think it's important that, you know, kids are going to be playing and going across, you're going to have travel, you're going to have a number of different potential heightened exposures, and we need to maintain our surveillance from the health department and our awareness of what's going on nationwide to make sure that this outbreak, which right now it is an outbreak, it is relatively contained in certain pockets, you've got a few sporadic cases starting up, that does not advance to be more of a propagated exposure and grow and become more of a major issue.
A bit less of a minute left, Dr. Romero.
So just to reinforce this, a lot of parents think, oh my God, it's good, it's summer's coming on, the risk of my child is going to be less, he's going to be, or she's not going to be going to school, there's less of a chance of being exposed. On the contrary, they're going to be exposed possibly by even greater by going to areas where kids congregate. So all we have to do is look at the Disneyland outbreak, right? It was a theme park for children. And that is exactly where we don't want this virus to spread. So going on vacation doesn't mean you're done with the risk. You may actually increase the risk.
Increase it.
There you go.
All right. Gentlemen, doctors, thank you very much for your time. As always, thanks to you for watching. See you next week.
For Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.